the nuclear weapons that Iraq had were nuclear weapons that were provided by the US back during the Iran war. A lot of people forget that as well. But just going back to the reason going to Iraq, like, how does the US benefit? Now, you talk about the clean break plan. I'd love for you to break that down for the audience. And I also want to understand how big of a role that played in the decision, because there's multiple factors. From obviously a lot of people talking about Iraq's oil, which doesn't make financial sense alone as a reason. Another one was to really show the world that the US has responded to 9/11 and Afghanistan was just not enough. Another one is the military-industrial complex. Obviously, they've got an incentive for more wars, and the clean break plan. I'd love you to break down this, explain what the clean break plan is, and then explain all these reasons of how big of a factor each one played.
Sure. Okay, so here's how I do it in the book, and I think makes the most sense. W. Bush is in charge. So let's start with him. Okay, he's the one sitting in the chair behind the desk calling the shot, not anybody else. So why does he want to do it? He wants to do it because he thinks it's a good way to get reelected. And this is what he told his father in 91. You should go all the way to Baghdad. That way we're still at war during the election 92. So you make sure to get reelected, Dad. And he sided with all the people who said that at the time. And then what happened? His father didn't listen to him, stopped the war short of Baghdad. And then even though he had a great victory, the election was a year and a half later and he lost. And W. Bush said to Miss Mickey Herskowitz, his biographer that he hired, and who they say that they tried to lie and say that this was a lie, but then his father, Bush Sr., hired Mickey Herskowitz again to write the biography of Prescott Bush after this. So I think that's a vote of confidence by Sr. in this man's work here. And Herskowitz quotes W. Bush saying, when he's the governor of Texas, if I'm elected president and I have a chance to invade Iraq, I'm going to take it, because that's what a president needs. To be a great president you have to be a war president, and you need an easy war so that then you can get the rest of your agenda through. Okay. And we're talking about W. Bush here. He cannot be subtle. Okay. He just says it in the plainest language of all. Why am I going to do this? Because it'll give me the advantage so I can try to privatize Social Security in my second term. Right, which of course, imagine that.
How's war with a country that has nothing to do with the US a good thing for being reelected? How does that make sense? Obviously, being linked to 9/11, anything would make sense. Where people are so angry, they need to let that anger out. But
all the great presidents are war presidents, Mario. Now you might say, yeah, but all the worst failures are war presidents too. And I would echo you there. But from W. Bush's point of view, this is what he said. To be a great president, you have to be a war president.
Right? So one is to be reelected. That's reason number one.
That's reason number one. Plus, I think he wanted to show up his dad. People say he wanted to avenge his dad for the plot against him, the fake plot against him of 93. That's possible. I think it's also true that he wanted to show that he was tougher and smarter than his dad, who had flinched and made the wrong decision. He was going to show what a real tough guy does and this kind of thing, and kind of show his dad up a little bit. That seemed to be quite a bit of what was going on there. But then you had Donald Rumsfeld. Now, Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense. He was actually Cheney's mentor. He came first. He was the higher rank guy. He was the one who had been chief of staff and had hired Dick Cheney under Gerald Ford. And they were the ones who, how Bush Sr. had been director of CIA? Well, that was actually Rumsfeld's doing. He had banished Bush Sr. to CIA, because this is right after the scandal of the Church Commission and Operation Chaos and all this stuff. And it was thought by making him the director of the CIA that would prevent him from ever being president, because Rumsfeld wanted to be president, was trying to get Bush out of his way. And he thought that was like tattooing CIA on his forehead so the American people would never vote for him. That's in Andrew Coburn's great book, Rumsfeld. So anyway, Rumsfeld had then made himself Secretary of Defense. And now here he was Secretary of Defense again. Right? He had been under Ford, that is. Now he's Secretary of Defense again. And this is at a time when there was this ongoing argument about the military and its form in the 21st century. The transformation of the military is what they called it. And they had all these competing projects. I remember one time in probably 99, 2000, they had a thing in the Wall Street Journal where it was like the competing visions for how to transform the military and what it should be. And Rumsfeld was very much of the opinion that he wanted to stick it to big army and give their money to the Air Force and the Special Operations Forces, because we're not going to fight a giant land war against Russia and Eastern Europe. So we don't need all those army divisions. We want to be light and fast, do regime changes, and then leave. Let the UN or somebody clean up the mess. But we want to be able to go in there and kick ass, special op, like a Lockheed promo video, right? Lockheed products with special operations know-how on the ground, minimal, light, and removable forces to get the job done, light and fast, and this and that. That was his attitude. And everybody makes such a big deal and a misunderstanding about the speech that he gave on September 10th, where he's out front of the Pentagon. What's he doing? He's saying there's $10 trillion missing, which was not exactly just $10 trillion had been embezzled away, but it was through the absolute poor, piss poor accounting at the Pentagon. They couldn't tell you where 10 trillion had gone. And or was it, I'm sorry, it was 3 trillion. It was September 10th. It was $3 trillion. But what's the point? The point is not that they spent the $3 trillion on September 11th. That's going to happen the next day or whatever these people seem to think. The point is he's beating the Army over the head. He's saying the Army has wasted this money, so I'm going to give it to the Air Force instead. That's mostly the point of that whole thing. So then that was his point too, what he wanted to do with Iraq. And, exactly what all, I mean, I don't know if the Israelis had anything on him or anything like that, but he was very close with the neoconservatives, seemed to be of one mind with his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, about all of this stuff, which, leads us to the neoconservatives. Because Colin Powell, he went along, but this was not his project. He was originally against it. Same for Condoleezza Rice. I don't know if she was necessarily against it, but they were on board with the program, but they were not the principals pushing it. Nor was this like CIA's agenda. They go, oh, CIA told us all the weapons. Well, W. Bush strong-armed the CIA into coming up with as much as they could, including they tortured lies out of people in order to implicate Iraq for backing Al-Qaeda. That's not to, I'm not saying that they're innocent. They told plenty of lies to lie us into that war. Only more narrow point I'm making is that this was not the CIA's agenda that we got to go and get rid of Saddam Hussein now, right? The former commander of Central Command, Anthony Zinni, he was the same way. Why do we have to do this? We don't have to do this. He actually gave a speech against it, wrote a great article. Was this speech? I think you can still find this. Yeah, I linked to it in my book, where he gave Anthony Zinni, the former head of Central Command. But we don't have to do this at all. So point being that I'm making is that this was not the broad consensus of the American government to do this. This was W. Bush had his reasons, and Donald Rumsfeld had his. And now then Dick Cheney, of course, the vice president, had his. And I think basically what it was he wasn't a very good CEO of Halliburton. And he wanted to in fact, the reason that they had hired him was he had formerly been the Secretary of Defense under Bush Sr. And the idea was he's close with the Pentagon. He can hook them up with a bunch of great construction contracts from the Army and stuff. But it was Democrat times during the 90s, and he didn't really have that much juice at the Pentagon in that way at that time. And so, he also bought a company called Dresser Industries that was being found liable for billions of dollars worth of asbestos cancer claims at that time. And now I saw where, I don't know, maybe it was just a comment section on YouTube or something where someone criticized me and said that I give too much weight to that because in fact Dresser Industries was still overall a good investment. That may be true, but it is definitely the case that it was a major scandal at the time that idiot Cheney and his CFO had bought this company and only almost immediately, like a couple of weeks later, realized that they have $1 billion worth of asbestos cancer claims coming in on all these liability suits, and that they had not done their due diligence on this company before buying it, and that it cost them at least $1 billion. I think he had major egg on his face. Now, maybe the comment section guy was right that they had made so much money by the time he became vice president that point was moot. I don't know, but I know that was a big scandal, and I know that one of the first things he did was put Halliburton on the military dole as fast as he possibly could. And I also know that Dick Cheney was at least tied for most eloquent spokesman of why it was wise to not go to Baghdad in 1991. Because he said, first, we'd be occupying a hostile country. We'd have to hunt down Saddam Hussein and get him to make sure that he would not be able to take the power back. And that might be a long and protracted effort. Our guys would be fighting in urban warfare combat, getting sniped from, apartment windows. And we would have all the regional neighbors would want to intervene. The Kurds could link up with other Kurds, and that would cause a problem for our friends, the Turks. The Iranians
pretty
might run
accurate.
south. He said, and the Syrians want the West, which that part wasn't really accurate unless he meant the Islamic State later after Obama built it for them. But anyway, so he was saying this was he said, we decided how many more American lives was Saddam Hussein worth? And the answer was not very damn many. And that was the right answer. And he said that numerous times, including on video on C-SPAN in 1994. And so he had clearly changed his mind by the time, not just after September 11th, but by the time he had become vice president of the United States. They were ready to go back over there and go back to war. And we know from Bush's Treasury Secretary, although he later backtracked a little bit, he said the entire subject matter of the first cabinet meeting of the new W. Bush administration was find me a way to do Iraq. And I think, by the way, this is a part of the explanation for why they were so lax on focusing on bin Laden in Afghanistan and the threat of a terrorist attack here was because the neoconservatives were counseling Bush. If we go to Afghanistan, we're never going to get to Baghdad. Don't listen to the CIA. Those guys are going to ruin everything if we do what they want by focusing on this thing. And so that was a big part of
Where does the clear break plan come in?
Okay, so
how big a role do you think that played?
Right. So when I get to the vice president, that's where I get to the neoconservatives, right? Because even though Cheney, of course, was just a conservative Republican and somewhat of a nationalist type, what he did was he hired the neocons. And so go back to, post-war. Who are the neoconservatives? The neoconservatives are a bunch of ex-Trotskyites and Cold War Democrats who then moved to the right and became Reaganites. And they dominated the National Review, the Weekly Standard Magazine, Commentary Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post editorial pages of especially Fox News, and all of the think tanks except the Council on Foreign Relations, which they got a lot of influence there now. The Council on Foreign Relations used to be the big one. Maybe it still is the big one, right? Founded after World War I by Morgan interests and then taken over by the Rockefellers. That's the preeminent foreign policy think tank in America. Well, the neoconservatives weren't really allowed there. And I think, this goes back to an earlier time where it was very much like dominated by Brooks Brothers, waspy wasps, Anglicans and Episcopalians and Yale skull and bonesy types, and that a bunch of upper middle class Jews and Catholics weren't really welcome to join their ranks much more than, to a limited degree. But these guys were intellectuals and wonks and extremely interested in foreign policy, in fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and in protecting Israel. And so what they did was they formed an alliance with the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex, separate from not entirely separate, but to a degree separate from the old banking and oil interests, they had their own policy. This was the new right, post-World War II new right. And they needed eggheads to write the studies to justify their business practices, right? The military buying weapons from them. So if oil and banking have the Council on Foreign Relations, then Lockheed and Northrop and Boeing, they get in bed with the neocons. And there are these major foundations, the Olin, Bradley, and Scaife foundations, which they seized control over. These are sort of old line conservative foundations. And then once they took them over, they also were able to take over the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute, two pre-existing and extremely important conservative foundations. Then from there, they created this whole forest of new ones, including the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the Project for New American Century, the Center for Security Policy, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. Right.
So that had influence in all these different think tanks.
Right. These are 100% their think tanks. This new forest of think tanks are all under neoconservative control. And so In the Reagan and Bush senior years, they had all got jobs as not all of them, but many of them had gotten jobs as deputy under assistant secretary of arms control, kind of way down the chain. And under Bush senior, his instruction, this would be 1991 through 1990, President 1989 through 93. His right-hand man, General Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor, he was under instructions to keep the crazies in the basement. And that meant that they're allowed to kill people down in Latin America, but they're not allowed to mess around with Middle East policy, right? They were somewhat marginalized there. Bush Sr. himself being a very waspy Episcopalian skull and bonesman, right, from the old establishment, and said, keep these guys, the crazies, in the basement. Now, through the Clinton years, they were sort of in exile, but they're running around. They're centered mostly around the American Enterprise Institute, the Project for a New American Century, and the Weekly Standard magazine of William Crystal, the son of Irving Crystal, who had been one of the original Trotskyoids who had helped found this sect. And so they helped to build the consensus. They wrote these letters to Bill Clinton demanding the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998 and demanding regime change there. And then these were the guys that Dick Cheney hired to run the W. Bush administration. Now, okay, I'll get back to that 1 second. Let me do the clean break now. The clean break is written principally by really one guy, David Wormser is his name, but really in conjunction with Richard Pearl. Richard Pearl was known as
Douglas as well, no?
Pardon me?
Douglas Feith as well?
Yes, Feith. Now, Feith signed the thing, only he now currently disavows it and said he had no role in its writing and whatever. And so I'll accuse Doug Feith of other things in 10 minutes, but I think this clearly was Pearl and Wormser together were doing this. I think Feith, and there was a guy named Charles Fairbanks Jr. and a couple of others who had signed on to the clean break as well. So I don't want to totally acquit them, but the fact of the matter is David Wormser wrote the damn thing, and Richard Pearl, was his buddy. And I think really Pearl is the boss of the relationship. Pearl is known as the Prince of Darkness and the major he called himself that, and was the major ringleader of the neoconservative mob in DC. So, when Wormser's writing, he's speaking for Pearl. I think I wouldn't want to lump Feith out, but I wouldn't want to lump him into a greater degree than he deserves, because he deserves plenty, but I don't want to, there's no need to embellish what we know he did do. So, but he did sign on to the thing. You're right about that. Now, here's the clean break, okay? And I know this sounds stupid, but it is stupid, and that's why it sounds stupid. It's not my fault.
I'm just looking at the image of the guy. It's like I just want to see the type of person that will just play such a big role. Yeah, exactly. It's such a big role in so many wars, so much death and destruction.
Oh yeah. Now, so people can find both of these articles at scotthorton.org/fair use. And the first one is called A Clean Break, a New Strategy for Securing the Realm. And the follow-up is called Coping with Crumbling States. And they also published a book, a little mini monograph called Tyranny's Ally, America's Failure to Remove Saddam Hussein. And they're all three the same damn thing over and over again, okay? So here's how it goes. Picture a good map of the Middle East in your head now. Iran is a problem for Israel because Iran backs Hezbollah by way of Syria. And now this article, this clean break is being written for Benjamin Netanyahu, not for the Americans. It's being written for Netanyahu when he's the incoming prime minister of Israel for the first time in 1996. And
by this American think tank.
That's right. No, they wrote this for an Israeli think tank, actually. This was not for PNAC. This was for the Israeli Institute for Advanced Strategic Studies or something very similar to that. I'm sorry, I always forget the name of it. But it was for an Israeli think tank, but it was written by these two American neoconservatives, primarily.
Okay.
Now, the argument is a clean break with what? A clean break with Oslo. A clean break with the promise that they're going to negotiate in good faith with the Palestinians and allow there to be anything like a pseudo-Palestinian state under the control of the Palestinian Authority. And they're saying, we're not going to do that. Just like Benjamin Netanyahu told the UN today, 2 states, forget you. Forget being a euphemism there for what he really meant to say. right? That's his same policy from 30 years ago. Okay. No way in the world are we doing this. We are stealing this land. Palestinians can burn in hell. We're taking it. That's the Likud doctrine. But there's a problem. Iran backs Hezbollah by way of Syria. And how do we steal Palestine when we got to deal with Hezbollah on our northern flank? And which is a problem for the people who live in northern Israel, have to keep fleeing, and could represent a much a bigger problem later. So if we want to continue grand theft Palestine and forever permanently destroy the Oslo peace process, and then what we need to do is we need to break Iranian power in the region, this arc of Iranian power from Iran to Syria to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Now, Mario, how do we do that according to David Wormser and Richard Pearl? By focusing on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. Yeah,
How does that make sense? How's
exactly.
Iranian's historical enemy destroying him would be a way to weaken Iran?
That's right. Secular Sunni Saddam, a 20% Sunni minority, lording it over the 60% Shiite majority that is adjacent to Iran, by the way, in the south and east of Iraq. How does that make sense? America just supported Saddam Hussein for 10 years, basically, through the 1980s to contain the Iranian Revolution.
So
Now,
what's
how
the
is this
answer?
supposed to make sense? Here's how it makes sense if you're an idiot. Well, Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi exile, the convicted bank embezzler, and burn spy. The CIA had already put a burn notice on him for his fake, ridiculous coup plot of 1995. CIA wouldn't even work with him anymore. But Wormser and Pearl say over and over again, they say it in A Clean Break, they say it in Coping with Crumbling States, and they say it in Tyranny's Ally. Ahmed Chalabi assures us that this is gonna be great. And what we're gonna do is, if we can do a coup, we will put in a Hashemite king, the cousin of the king of Jordan. And he will then lord it over the Iraqis. And the Iraqi Shiite supermajority, well, they will just bend down and worship a Hashemite king, because a Hashemite king claims to have the blood of the prophet, even though they're Sunnis and even though they're obvious British sock puppets and imposters. Oh, yeah, no, the Iraqi Shiite supermajority will worship them and obey their every magic wish and command. This is totally bogus nonsense that Chalabi was pushing, because he was lying to them and they were fools. And they ended up replacing the Hashemite king in their plan with Chalabi himself. What we're going to do is we're going to do a regime change, and Chalabi will be the new dictator of Iraq, and he will work with us, and the new Shiite-dominated Iraq will then be friends with Israel, and most importantly, the Shiite clergy in Najaf, under America, Jordan, and Turkey's thumb, they will tell Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran, because the Shiite clergy in Najaf, Iraq, they are a higher rank. Remember, Shiite Islam originates
So
in Iraq.
it's trying to make Iran no longer the leader of the Shia Muslims.
That's right.
And
By
they will be able to take away the
leader-
proxies from Iran. Okay.
That's right. By making Iraq the leader of the Shiite Muslims, but the Iraqi Shiite Muslims under the thumb of the United States and their allies, which is, of course, a ridiculous, idiotic pipe dream. And we already, to fast forward to the end of the story, we already know that when America followed this idiot advice, they ended up fighting an 8-year civil war for the Shiite side, for Iran's best friends, the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq and the Dawa Party. These were the Iraqis who had chosen Iran's side after the Iranian Revolution and when the Iran-Iraq War broke out. They're the same guys who Bush Sr. told to rise up and overthrow Saddam in 91, who then he betrayed and let Saddam crush them. Why? Because, they're coming across the border from Iran to lead the revolution. Oops. And so they let Saddam Hussein crush the revolution. That was the excuse to stay then. And now what does W. Bush do? W. Bush takes Iran's best buddies, Skiri and Dawa, all the way to Baghdad and ensconces them in power. So where David Wormser wrote that a Shiite democratic Iraq will be a, quote, nightmare for Iran, no, it'll be a nightmare for the United States. It'll be an If you talk about a hoped for but unexpected gift to bin Laden by driving all the Iraqi Sunnis into violent insurgency, how about a hoped for but unexpected gift to the Ayatollah that his buddy Chalabi lied to the American Zionists and convinced them to convince